Good afternoon, Gosazabola, everyone. A nation's future will mirror the quality of her youth. A nation cannot fool herself into thinking of a bright future when she has not invested wisely in her children. His Majesty the King. Welcome to your UN House and to the 37th session of Bhutan Dialogues. Providing adequate investments that enable children to thrive is a moral imperative, and investing in a child is to invest in society's future. Most would agree that there could be no more compelling argument than that. The international community has recognized that investing in children is not only essential, but an obligation as outlined under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC. The science of child development tells us that even temporary deprivations experienced by young children can have irreversible effects on their future capabilities and in turn a nation's future. We are already seeing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on children. Interventions and policy choices made today will determine whether our children and youth are able to reach their full potential. Our topic today is understanding human rights and creating a safer world for children. Our speaker today is Dr. Rinchen Chophel, an expert on gender, human rights, and a key champion of child rights and ending violence against children. Dr. Rinchen Chophel is an elected member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child and continues to support a multitude of agencies, including the SAARC Secretariat, in many key regional projects and initiatives. Our host, Dr. Karma Futso, as you are all aware, is the founder of Loden Foundation. Dr. Karma is also the deputy chairperson of the team spearheading the development of the 21st Century Economic Roadmap. As I close, I request everyone present here today to keep your questions short and to the point. Please drop your questions in the chat box. Sharing Nanogan will be compiling the questions and will read them out. The speaker will answer your questions at the end of the session, as usual. Please allow me to end with a quote from the UN Secretary General in reference to children. I will spare no effort to make sure the United Nations is working every day, every hour, every minute for your best interests, and UNICEF is on the front line of this effort. Every day, all of us at the United Nations ask ourselves, how can we work together to best support and protect you, the children of the world? I'm Dr. Will Parks, the head of UNICEF, very happy to be introducing our speakers today. Tashi Dilek, and thank you.
Kuzuzambo, and I am so tempted to say Ajo because we are from the same area in Bhutan, and you are a senior relative, so I think it's quite appropriate to address you as Ajo. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and today is the second day of the fourth month. There's Sagadawa or Vishek, which is one of the holiest months in the Bhutanese calendar, and I think it's so good if you can begin this session by thinking about empathy and compassion. Often in this frenzy of our egocentric life, we forget compassion and empathy, and particularly compassion and empathy for the very vulnerable, poor, weak members of the society. And talking about children, we are basically talking about very vulnerable, innocent section of the society. And you have spent so much work, so much time working on the welfare of the children. A wonderful work of compassion, I would say. In fact, I want to congratulate you for being the first Bhutanese also to now be on the Commission for Rights of Children, the UN CRC. I think we make a lot of policies and decisions sometimes without enough thinking, without enough information and discussion. So it's so important, I think, everyone, when you talk about children's rights, that we have some deliberations on what really counts as children's rights. What is the status of children right now in the world in general, in our region, because you're leading also the SAARC, the South Asia, what is it?
Initiative to End Violence Against Children.
Yes. So thank you for coming, joining us. You are normally based in Nepal, so it's great that we have you here at this time. Although it's also sad to hear that Nepal at the moment is going through quite rough times through the pandemic. What's the situation like there right now? Do you have any update on?
Situation, of course, both in Nepal as well as other countries in the region, except Bhutan probably is not something that we can be comfortable with, or even wish that something like that would happen in our own country. And I'm sure that with whatever is being done by His Majesty the King and the response created by the government, I'm sure we will be much more safer than any other country in the world for that matter. And as you said, discourse on human rights and creating a safer world for children couldn't be held at a better time than during the Sagadawa month. Human rights is something which is generally looked at as something that is a trigger for, unruly, uncouth, even, very reactionary type of, situation where people create environments which do not necessarily conform to anything remotely like compassion and spirituality. But I believe that's a very wrong and misguided, even sometimes vested interest, guided type of notion. In my last 30 years of work, particularly the last 25 years with the dedicated, work being a foot soldier for child rights and human rights and gender and women's empowerment in the region and beyond. There's nothing, human rights is probably as close as compassion and spirituality can get. And if you look at the history and genesis of human rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and look at many religions of the world, and particularly because I'm a Buddhist, my interest is human rights and Buddhism together. There is a very strong association of what human rights tries to promote, advocate, and what the Buddhist religion tries to promote in terms of spirituality. And one of my very close friends, I'm a convener for the Asia Pacific Interfaith Network for Ending Violence Against Children. And I meet all the religious leaders and experts who are currently in the philanthropic world of ending violence against children. And one of my colleagues, a very renowned Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka, said, the only difference between Buddhism and the spirituality Buddhism professes and human rights is that human rights do not profess a reincarnation. Otherwise, everything is same. And in fact, if you look at the 30 rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 8 Noble Fold, Eightfold Path, you can really align both the theory as well as practice of it. So I'm happy that you started the dialogue from that point of view.
Sometimes I wonder whether even the term human rights is giving the wrong impression. So even in Dzongkha, Wangcha gives you this impression you are claiming some entitlement, some demands, whereas human rights seem to be really fulfilling the needs of the people. So if it's children's rights, we are talking about children's needs, what they need: food, shelter, security, safety, freedom, and so forth. So when you look at human rights from that perspective, it's really filling in a gap, often to help the poor and the weak in the society when they're being abused or exploited by the more powerful one. I actually wanted to ask you further on how you got into this, because I think a lot of audience would want to know this. What inspired you or motivated you to get onto this mission to help the children of the region?
Interesting events in my life was on the last day of my career in the civil service in 2010, December. We had this large, advocacy awareness campaign held in the Royal Banquet Hall for all the who's who in the country, parliamentarians, women's leaders, and senior bureaucrats. And next day, the Queensland headline said the Executive Secretary of the NCWC resigns in protest which I look at it from, sometimes as something that takes me back to my days as a civil servant, and sometimes the same issue where human rights, as you're saying, gets misinterpreted. And sometimes a lot of things are not in your control. Now, a lot of people I've had a lot of colleagues who have asked me to give permission to do my autobiography. And I've been tempted thinking that they may do a very romantic, very illustrious autobiography. But the fact of the matter is that, I'm actually, like many of us, most of us actually, is a classical product of investments by my country. So therefore, one of the things I think in my life I've always tried to keep my perspective clear is that, everything I'm doing now is because my country invested in me. So therefore, it becomes important for me to try and see how what I have gained over the years in terms of experience, in terms of knowledge, and also in terms of my personal stature as a, both global and regional human rights defender, advocate, should be to see how best I can, create a better understanding of human rights and help my colleagues who are currently in the, field responsible for this to be able to appreciate this and then deliver better services. Most of the time, I think we sometimes tend to get distracted by events in our life which do not necessarily are pleasant. I have had my share of events in my life that every now and then propelled me to have very rebellious, sometimes even reactive, approaches to my life. But the positive influences were much more, I think, important. And when I found that my life as a civil servant was not becoming very productive, then I decided to make a move. And the fact that I was given the responsibility of, spearheading the drafting of the Bhutan's first CRC report in '99 and presented in 2021 in the committee, actually gave me a purpose. And then later on, when the National Commission for Women and Children was established, I had the privilege of being appointed from the highest authority as the executive director. And I believe that that's what set me in my journey forward. And
was there some kind of inner calling as well, where you sort of felt, I found my vocation? Because you were trained as a medical doctor.
Yes. And medicine is a fundamental right. I think that's also important as much as education is. But definitely, I think, when you find something that makes you feel good and something that you feel, gives you a purpose,
Yes.
then I think that's the road one should take. And I did that, and I'm happy I took that road. And then when I realized that to get certain things triggered at the national level, you need to create a larger regional mechanism bringing different states. So I then moved forward to create and help architect this regional organization called the SAIEVAC, which is the South Asia Initiative to End Violence Against Children. And then it became an important regional movement, and different global movements required South Asia initiatives to become more vibrant. So then my role started getting expanded from national to regional to global. And I believe a lot of people think I left some interesting, well-paying UN NGO jobs to take this movement forward. But I always tell them, you may have more money in your bank, more happiness in my bank. So I have no regrets as far as I'm concerned. And today I'm happy that I also represent Bhutan in the Human Rights Treaty body as the first Bhutanese. So it gives you a lot of satisfaction about that.
So with your long experience, your very clear understanding of the global situation of human rights and children, with your expertise in the region on that front, and then your intimate knowledge of the situation in Bhutan, where would you rank Bhutan. How are we doing? How are we faring in terms of children's rights, human rights? What are the main challenges the nation is facing? If you can share with all honesty, I mean, I know you wouldn't censor yourself much, but where are we in terms of global comparisons or regional comparisons, and where we should be, right, even without comparing to others?
A lot of policymakers in Bhutan needs to reflect on and appreciate. I've worked very closely with all the 8 countries of SAARC. I'm a very familiar face in the corridors of power in all the 8 countries. With the civil society, I have 8 very well represented civil society networks, which sometimes actually provide me so much strength in terms of also negotiating with political entities. And then I'm on number of global and other cross-regional platforms in my capacity as advisors or in my capacity as, steering committee members. And one of the things I've always tried to reflect on the work that I do out there is my experience in Bhutan. Like, for example, South Asia has about 1.7 billion people, right? Which is about 1/4 of the world's population. And Bhutan is less than 1 million, right? It was 700,000 something. It is estimated that, of course, these are all pre-pandemic estimates, that close to 45.8 million human beings are working in slave-like conditions, out of which 55% are considered to be women and children. Now, about 50% of children in the region are considered unregistered. That means with the potential risk of becoming stateless. Right? We have close to, let's say, 45% of women in child marriage in South Asia. That means getting married below 18. And things may be different in Bhutan in terms of survival and development opportunities and rights for girls who get married underage in Bhutan compared to other countries. But this is an area which completely takes away the rights and empowerment and opportunities for a more empowered life for millions of girls out there. Look at the political environment, the leadership. There are more, issues created in other countries by politics that are not really pro-citizenship, right? Pro-citizens. And I use my example all the time, wherever I go, saying that I would like to see in this country, what my country did for me. I'm sure you know that those days, after I finished my class 6 in Bhutan Jakar Primary School, I had the privilege of going to Gangneung. And I would walk, at least 2 rounds I did walking and sleeping 7 nights on the road to reach Gangneung School. But then you need to have some motivation, some inspiration that is provided by powers beyond you that gives you that, motivation to, go to such lengths to access education. And then completing my education and going to medicine and then going through all these development phases, I believe is a classical example of what Bhutan actually does for their children and for the citizens. So when you talk about child rights, there is so much Bhutan can showcase. There's so much Bhutan can teach the rest of the world. But ranking is something I'm very uncomfortable with. Like, for example, gross national happiness. We propagate gross national happiness to the world.
Yes.
And the World Happiness Report ranks us where?
Quite low, in fact. Well,
very low.
As per
and
our
then,
expectation.
you have countries like Pakistan becoming the happiest country in South Asia 2 consecutive years. Now it is Nepal, the happiest country. And it, in a way, sometimes when you reflect on it, it undermines the sanctity of GNH. So that's why this ranking and breaking down philosophies into, indicators and then trying to put values does have a negative bearing. And for that matter, I think ranking children and child rights is also something which I feel is not appropriate. Bhutan and India can never be compared, or Bhutan and Maldives can never be compared. the political situation, the environment, the traditions and cultures and customs, the communities within which children grow, everything is so different. So therefore, we must evaluate our own investments for children using our own benchmarks and not any other. And from that point of view, one thing which I always underline is there's so much Bhutan can teach the rest of the world, whether it is in terms of what human rights is all about, or even what child rights and what issues related to women's empowerment or gender equality, equity is concerned. But we must also be honest enough and transparent enough, frank enough, to be able to say when we have an issue that we have an issue, and then take the bull by the horns, not try and hide behind so-called common language which we use. Oh, this is sensitive. Oh, this affects the image of the country. I think those actually do little disservice to the most wonderful investments from whatever limited resources our government has for our people. So from that point of view, I think we need to be little more conscious of the need to be pragmatic in terms of our approaches, while at the same time be able to say black is black, white is white, right?
So I understand that these ranking systems have an issue, have problems. But when we look at Bhutan, suppose issues like child marriage wouldn't be so significant or wouldn't be a big issue. But when we, for instance, look at statistics, like last year, we've heard from the UNICEF chief that there was like 40% increase in domestic violence, much which would be also against children. And then I think about 235 cases reported to the police, which again I think would be perhaps at the most half of what's actually happening. So even if there were only 235 cases during the last lockdown, that's a big number for a country that teaches happiness or advocates happiness.
Yeah.
So have we made progress from, say, the previous century or from the last decade? Or what's your take? Are we making steps in the right direction? And should the agencies and the government offices or CSOs responsible for this do more? What can be done to make the situation of children better?
One example, which was provided by one of my, old colleagues, classmates, when we were discussing, about our life in Kowloon and our life now. And when I said, so what has changed? What he's saying is, what has changed is that we no longer have our people, immersed in mud and doing rice plantation, and have the whole, environment to yourself, to now looking at from small windows in the concrete jungle in Thimphu. So basically, this is the difference in terms of how structurally we have transitioned. If you look at communities in Bhutan, one of the biggest challenges which the Royal Government of Bhutan faces, and I think it's a huge concern, is this rural-urban migration and this tragic, news about gungtongs and. The other thing that we continuously talk about is Bhutan's high enrollment rate, 98% or something. And when you do that, the yardstick from class PP to class 12 or 10, whatever. And then my concern as a human rights advocate is, so what is missing? Now, taking a direct reference to enrollment, then that 2%. So for the Royal Government of Bhutan, the children of Bhutan are those who are in mainstream education. And if that is the case, then have Bhutan actually made 100% universal enrollment in schools? But what about that 2%? So we have children in monastic schools, and we have children who are in the villages, the report says in the highlands, right? And there are a lot of children who are not in school. So what do we do about reaching out to those? The resources of the Royal Government of Bhutan in the social sector, every child has equal share. That's the way I look at it. So therefore, if that is the case, then the 2% is the one that the rural government of Bhutan needs to chase. The 98% who are in the school must then be left for, empowered parents, who are able to provide for themselves, who are able to keep their children in school, to actually supplement, right? And the government's scarce resources must be plowed in where the vulnerabilities still prevent children from accessing mainstream education. And education is the fundamental gateway to accessing all types of rights. If you give education to girls, they will not drop out of. If you take care of them and give them proper education, they are going to move on forward, right? And we need to be able to do that. So if you're talking about now domestic violence, if you're concerned about the 200 plus complaints that has come to the police, I would also like to see what is the statistics like before the lockdowns or no lockdown situation in normal pre-pandemic settings. And I still believe from reports from Renew and NCWC, it's really something to be concerned about. And then one of the things which you hear all the time, and in the recent from the elections, one of the things I heard in the campaign is that we have lost that community vitality and harmony. That in one apartment there is a family mourning the death of a loved one. In the other apartment there is a birthday party going on or some ceremony, enjoying some loud music. So that means if a building has this type of environment, and when you set a lockdown, put people in a lockdown mode, curtailing their freedom, curtailing their ability to have their own small spaces, even curtailing the emotional impact of people in a setting like that, then it is natural that human emotions take over, and then violence, abuse take over. And Bhutan, despite the fact that we are a small society, 200 plus complaints is something to be concerned about. Just imagine how many are not even taking or bothering to complain, and how many would like to complain but do not have that ability to complain or know how to do that complaint. So from that point of view, what is critical, and this is something which even overall child rights and overall the CEDAW Convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and for that matter, even the UPR, and that UPR is the Universal Periodic Review, which governments have to do periodically, and which is an intergovernmental review process, whereas CEDAW, CRC are a treaty-based review process where independent experts do the review. There is a need for creating proper structures, monitoring mechanisms, and have entities that can independently monitor, assess, and hold service providers, including the government, accountable. So that is what is required. And for example, if we are talking about the police must have adequately equipped, fully capacitated people who can respond effectively with capacity to do counseling, as well as easy complaints and response systems to be able to do that. Because we talk about this many complaints. What has happened after the complaints were made? Because if both sides are not met, for example, it's also the same thing about missing children, right? We have a lot of missing children reported. But if, let's say, in 1 year there were about 62 missing children reported in the old days when I was still active with the NCWC, and police records at the end of the year indicate about 12 or 13 pound. So the rationale is that when they are found, they are not reported back. That's well and good. But if they are not reported back, and if they are not found, then where did they go? Bhutan is not such a huge, complex country with such a huge population density that we won't know. So therefore, it does present a lot of concerns as to what is happening. So these are the issues that require proper, institutional mechanisms to be put in place.
So we don't at the moment have sufficient institutional mechanisms or infrastructure, human capacity in place at the moment. Is that what you're?
This is very important as well as of great concern to me in terms of the topic itself. The National Commission for Women and Children, when it was first established, it took, after the first terms of reference was developed for institutional structure to be created to take responsibilities for international instruments like CRC then, and later on with CEDAW. It was supposed to be an independent, autonomous body that acts like a watchdog and has that ability to monitor, has the ability to investigate and prosecute cases of violation of rights of women and children. But slowly, the NCWC became like a national machinery for women and children, so fulfilling more government's obligations, which was also part of it, but did not have the capacity to build effective, institutional intervention strategies to take the other part of the thing. So therefore, today, NCWC do not have, I think, the necessary capacity to, like, for example, hold, let's say, the GNHC accountable in terms of, ensuring that there are adequate financial and resources provided for, promoting and protecting the rights of women and children, or for that matter, asking the Royal Civil Service Commission for adequate human potential and capacity. And also to actually hold the system itself accountable in terms of, securing the rights of women and children. So from that point of view, if the NCWC is going to fulfill its responsibilities of what it is doing now, then I think it's also important to create an independent mechanism that actually becomes like a mirror that reflects what you're doing and what you're not doing at the same time. So this is an area which I think is important, so that system becomes a little more proactive, not just reactive, proactive in terms of ensuring that, they respond to such violations effectively and put necessary, resources in place to be able to deal with this. So I personally think that is one part. The other part is we have our civil society organizations. Now, if you look at other countries, the civil societies act like alternate response systems, right, to the system. And if we look at our civil society organizations, most do not have that mission, mandate, or capacity to do that. Their only, primary focus is to provide services, and look at, welfare and charity, and not necessarily rights approach. And that actually puts a connotation, a very negative connotation to the overall work of the Royal Government of Bhutan vis-a-vis rights of women and children, because we treat women and children like objects of charity, whereas they are rights holders. And we have to make sure that we respect that part, that they are fundamental pillars and components of the Bhutanese society, and sometimes much more important, and therefore their rights must be fulfilled. And rights are not just content in our national laws and policies. These are instruments to which Bhutan has formally, prescribed and committed to. So there are larger issues in place.
So obviously CSOs work mostly in voluntary basis, so a different group of people. But when you look at state institutions like NCWC, they have to both be accountable to someone or some institution and also be provided for by these institutions. I suppose it's in the end the parliament, the lawmakers who have to, especially when they talk about rights, they have to legislate the right acts and laws. So when you look at the current parliament or the past parliaments until now, are our parliamentarians conscious and aware of the rights of children and women? And do we have enough legal instruments in place that meets also the obligations we have to the international treaties and the obligation to the society?
Recently finished a series of interesting, interactions. Like we had on 9th April, we spent one day on having a dialogue with parliamentary committee chairs, presided over by the speaker himself in Paro. And then after that, we had, from 26th to 29th of April, we had 4 days in Wangdi with parliamentarians also present on the first day, and then 3 days of looking at Bhutan's concluding observations on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the 2 optional protocols, and also cross-referring to the CEDAW concluding observations, and even relevant UPR. One thing is quite obvious, that there isn't enough understanding about what human rights is overall and what human rights means for Bhutan. I think this is really important to understand. We need to understand that human rights is not all about burning tires, blocking roads, vandalizing shops, cursing your leadership, and literally creating anarchy. That's not really what human rights is all about. Human rights is basically a very holy, translation and interpretation of an individual's purpose in life. You're born as a human being. You must inculcate human qualities, and then you actually learn to live with dignity in your community. That's ultimately what human rights is all about. So I think there is a need to understand that a little better, both not just in parliamentarians, but society as a whole. That we should not look at human rights as that strange animal that has been brought in Bhutan from, generally referred to as a Western concept. There's nothing more righteous than the Buddhist perceptions of compassion and spirituality. And as human beings and as Buddhists, what can be more close, right? And having, God-like kings, in this country. So therefore, I think that perception needs to be. But at the end of the day, there are also certain fundamental aspects which must be understood, and which I think our parliamentarians also need to, and we try to discuss that in great detail. For example, if the Parliament of Bhutan, say for example, first we have the Constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan. The Constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan has Articles 7, 8, and 9, which, if you look at it with a very broad and all-encompassing, and honest, transparent reflection, it contains all the Universal Declaration rights, the UN Charter's mission and mandate, all are very much reflected there. So therefore, it is not that we do not have guiding principles and guiding, instruments that, can make us a little more embracing of human rights. Now, there are acts and laws and policies which the Parliament ratifies, right? Now, I will not go into other laws, but specific to children and women, the Child Care and Protection Act, the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, the Child Adoption Act. I know these acts like the back of my hand because I actually spearheaded the drafting of these acts before I left. And we had, the drafting committee consisted of, all who is who in the judiciary and in our civil society and government entities. The recently, abdicated Chief Justice was the chair of the drafting committee. So, and all these acts have NCWC as the, what do you call that? What is the right word? The dedicated agency, competent authority for these acts. And then we have parliamentarians asking, what is the legal authority of NCWC? So I believe there is a fundamental gap in terms of understanding the role of entities like NCWC and obligations of parliamentarians when they review whether it is budget, functions of the executive, or the role of parliamentarians themselves. So that's why I said, if there isn't enough capacity in the NCWC, as a citizen of Bhutan and someone who is sitting on a treaty body mechanism, I would actually look at the parliament and say, what are you doing about it? Not asking NCWC. I would ask the parliament. And if NCWC needs to be revamped in terms of ensuring that it is able to fulfill the aspirations with which it was established, who is going to do that? It's the parliamentarians, right? And parliamentarians cannot, I think, shy away that the executive is responsible. Who is the executive? Who is the cabinet? They are parliamentarians. They are a subset of the parliament itself. So that's one part. The other part is that in other countries, you could, move the Supreme Court or High Court and get a Supreme Court directive to be issued to ensure that certain things are put in place, which we do not practice here. For example, we had SAIEVAC had massive problem with child marriage in India. And we have a lot of agencies, both national as well as international agencies, UN agencies working on this. But somehow we are not able to get strong legal, directive or basis on which to make sure that child marriage is criminalized. So in SAIEVAC and my partner agencies, we moved the Supreme Court of India, and Supreme Court issued a directive saying child marriage is rape. And that changed the dynamics completely. So therefore, if somebody is involved in child marriage, you just prosecute them for rape and not necessarily hide behind Sharia laws or not hide behind, I'm doing this because I want to protect my girl, it's for the safety of the girl, or I'm poor, so poor that if my girl grows older, I have to pay bigger dowry. You can't hide. There are a lot of realities there. But the fact is, it is not for the parents' comfort that a child is being given out for a child. We need to look at the child who's given out to marriage. It's her life that needs to be secured and protected, right? And who is responsible for that? It is the state. There are clear articles in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. For example, Article 2 and is the main one. There is Article 9 in CEDAW, 16.9 target in SDGs. All these actually bring clear ensuring that identity is not lost, that child's identity. And so basically these are the things which call for a greater degree of understanding of our parliamentarians on this. And most of the time, since it's connected, like I showed the constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan. So the Supreme Court is the guardian and also the interpreter of the constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan. So if something like these 200 plus domestic violence cases are happening, who should be disturbed? I would think the Supreme Court and the judiciary needs to be immensely disturbed that this is happening, and they call for some response as to what is being done out there. And I think this is how it has to be. Otherwise, if we are going to have executive branch and pushing for laws and policies, Parliament reviewing it and ratifying it, and then judiciary interpreting it, ultimately, where do we ask for justice? Where is the institution of justice? So these are things that needs to be, I think, understood a little more clearly.
But at least with the domestic violence, it's already illegal, isn't it? So it's more a problem of implementation. But would there be an example of a law being introduced, a legal instrument being introduced that could actually change the issues that we face with regard to children, like say statelessness if you don't, or civil registration, not getting one if you don't have a father to show. Do you have any specific examples of how one simple change in the legal system, in the laws, that either the Parliament can introduce or the judiciary can enforce, that could change the welfare of the children or many children in Bhutan? Any specific, before we turn to the audience for questions?
Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, to address it honestly and frankly, right? And also this is very much in all the concluding observations of CRC as well as CEDAW and in the UPR. And it's also very much, I'm sure, in the SDGs. I have not seen the SDG reports, which I should actually. But basically the the issue is having ratified the convention with no reservations. That means you commit to fulfilling every article in those instruments. The CRC, without going explicitly into the text, overall it says that for all children in the jurisdiction of a state party, the state party must treat all children without discrimination and must ensure that the children, irrespective of their all other parameters, their rights must be respected and ensured. So that's one part. The other thing is that every child, the recommendations come very clearly that Bhutan must make sure that there are very simple procedures to register children, irrespective of who the parent is, right? Or whether they are, have both the parents or not, right? Does not matter whether the child has a father or a mother. And sometimes I also wonder, why do we need to look for a father when you cannot dispute the mother of the child? And if the mother of the child is a Bhutanese, why do we need to look for a father to register that child? So those are the things which actually are going to continue if we don't address them effectively. And ultimately, it's not just about having stateless children or citizens ultimately, but also our obligation as a member of the global community. If we create statelessness, ultimately, where do these people go? What is their allegiance to Bhutan as they grow up? How are they going to align themselves, let's say, with the Kingdom of Bhutan and with the national flag of Bhutan? I think those are things that needs to be looked at. And basically, we cannot say that we are trying to protect the sanctity and sovereignty of our country, because we are a global village now. And the classical example is the pandemic. Something that happens out there, we are struggling. And we are struggling, but in other places in the region, look at how the pandemic has created. So it is the same situation. I think you can look at it from that same philosophical point of view. But it is important that every child who is in the state, within the jurisdiction of Bhutan, it's the responsibility of the government of Bhutan. And I think that must be underlined, I think. And how it is going to be dealt with is something that the Royal Government of Bhutan, within its existing national laws and policies, will have to take forward. But the international community and the treaty bodies will continue to raise this issue.
The first two questions. How can international organizations and the Royal Government of Bhutan collaborate to promote child protection in Bhutan? And how can individuals help towards promoting protection of children in Bhutan?
Well, we are in the UN house. And I believe UN is one of the most important partners with whom national agencies need to work together. And there are also a lot of other international bilateral agencies who also, I think, contribute to the social sector. I'm considered to be sometimes a maverick. I'm sometimes accused of not conforming to mainstream thought process. One of my biggest battles in my mind is that sometimes our UN agency itself becomes a challenge, right? Agencies do take a lot of burden in terms of delivering services, ensuring rights are protected. But you go to the Security Council, and we have a process where we have 5 big powers who have veto powers, and you may put the rest of the world on one side and one country on the Security Council with a veto right. They're not going to listen to the rest of the world. So therefore, where is democracy? And what do we talk about human rights? But the fact of the matter is that UN is also created by state parties together. It's a United Nations agency. So therefore, national agencies as well as United Nations agencies, both are equally accountable to ensure that services are provided to vulnerable population groups, particularly women and children. And from that point of view, I think there is a need for closer dialogue, more transparency, avoid duplication. What we need to do is create convergence and stop competing for scarce resources. And that's what we are doing actually. Sometimes we are competing for scarce resources, and then we compartmentalize the country into this Dzongkhag, this agency is one, this Dzongkhag, and sometimes we duplicate initiatives and services, and sometimes this creates a problem. But I think Bhutan probably is not in a situation like that compared to, I have a lot of problem in other countries in terms of creating that convergence, and I invest a lot of energy in doing that. It's the responsibility of every individual. And when you say individuals, one thing comes to my mind, what His Majesty said about the COVID response, right? One person can undo everything that we are doing. And I think similarly, every individual taking a conscious effort to create a more harmonious, more responsive community and society, which would then translate into a larger national and ultimately to a bigger global harmony. I think every individual is responsible. And more so, I think, when you talk about child rights, the focus on every child and ensuring that child understands both the rights and responsibilities, and at the same time is being provided the necessary environment within which he or she grows up and is able to also express his or her own views and aspirations. I think that is what is important. And if we do that, I think we are already considered in South Asia a model state and a happy state for women and children to grow in. We have our challenges, but compared to other countries, we are definitely, as what many refer to as the Shangri-La.
Since the inception of the 12th Five-Year Plan, RGOB has invested a lot of resources considering children, but there is the vacuum of coordination amongst the agencies working on the same issues. Are the service providers fully prepared in terms of rendering services if clients such as children in conflict with the law come forward? And the other question is, for young people who are interested in working in child welfare, what advice do you have for them in terms of preparing for this difficult field of work?
One of the main messages that I'm trying to get out there in the response towards the pandemic is that we need to create convergent strategic approaches. Let's not work in silos. And ultimately, the discourses and efforts should not be at apex institutions or places. It must be grounded at the grassroots, must strengthen community approaches, must be able to strengthen families, individuals, and ultimately ensure that we invest in the ability of children to create that response, young people to create that response. And take an example of child marriage. Wherever we have children's organizations who are empowered to monitor and create surveillance on child marriage, that community has had lesser and lesser degrees of child marriage. Why? Because if one girl is suddenly not coming to school, their classmates immediately raise an alarm and then start looking for reporting to civil society groups, to the police, and then they stop child marriages. So this is what needs to be done. So create convergent approaches, but strategic focus for response and strategic action should be on the ground.
There was a slightly more specific element in that question regarding children in conflict with law.
Mm-hmm.
And I think today a lot of the youth delinquents are sent to the Youth Delinquent Retention Center in Simalaka, which is managed by the police. One of our earlier guests, to name him, Dr. Rinchen, was suggesting that to keep the youth delinquents under police is itself the wrong approach. So what is your take on dealing with young people in conflict with law and how to address this issue by helping them rather than criminalizing them further?
This is tragic in the sense that why should we actually make criminals of normal relationships, particularly if we set up clear guidelines and provisions for what is legal and not legal. So in many countries they have the age for sexual consent. That does not necessarily mean that the age of sexual consent gives you the legal right to get married. Now, because we don't have that, so these statutory rape provisions of 18 and under, and invariably the boy being the perpetrator, which actually brings in another very worrying element of reverse discrimination against the boy child. And then we have these children placed in Simasham. And whether we like it or not, we can argue in any ways we want, saying that Simasham is a rehabilitation center. But the fact of the matter is that you have been displaced from mainstream. And then the psychological, and we live in small communities, right? You're going to be branded. And in my time in NCWC, we have dealt with a number of these cases. We have pleaded with different agencies to look at this. And I still believe that we still have that in place, statutory rape provision. So till that time, we are continuously going to have this problem. And we are going to have children under 18 entering into sexual relationships, but not being able to come out in the open for fear of this. And then, the issues of teenage pregnancies, high-risk pregnancies, and then we have issues related to abortion is very defined in Bhutan. Officially, abortion is a no-no. So then we cause a lot of damage and even loss of life of a lot of young girls. So I think this has not just, Simasham is just one issue. I think we need to look at much more deeper and wider.
So that's one thing that I want to ask, time permitting, the statutory rape provision. What can we do about it? What would be your proposal? While it would be good to hinder sort of teenage pregnancies and teenage sexual relations as much as possible, it's inevitable some people will, before turning 18, get into sexual activities. Are we going to criminalize all of them? Should we opt for another alternative of, say, reading the age gap between the two persons, or bring down the age of sexual consent to 16 or 15, wherever it's appropriate, and then keep marriage at 18? Even the idea of 18 as this milestone, it doesn't really suit the Bhutanese context. We had in our history many important figures getting married at 14, 15, 16. And if you look at current situation, even children at mid-20s are not mature enough to be married. So what would be your proposal to solve this problem we have with the statutory rape?
Even in the UN and INGO and our, the human rights defenders networks and civil society groups, age is a huge debate. Whether we are talking about child marriage, whether we are talking about rape provisions, whether we are talking about age for allowing children to work. And to me, sometimes, and I have been criticized for my views by a number of groups, to me, what is the difference between a 16 and an 18-year-old girl or boy, right? A 16-year-old girl, even a younger girl in a rural area, is able to manage a family and manage to run her. And like you said, sometimes even 20, 24, we have college graduates coming home and they are not even able to take care of themselves. So age is sometimes that Berlin Wall which refuses to fall down, right? But I still think that we need a benchmark so that certain legality can be established for saying what is right and what is not right. Otherwise, there's no end to what can happen. When it comes to even child marriage, in many countries, like I said, they have age for sexual consent, right? And the primary focus should be on ensuring that there is sex education, there is sexual and reproductive health education introduced early. There needs to be proper services in place that what is allowed does not become exploitative. I think those things are important to be dealt with. We cannot just say that this is not allowed, and if a report comes, we will prosecute. If nothing happens, we keep quiet. But it cannot be double standard like that. And from what I know in Bhutan, the rates of child marriage seems to be very high, quite high, from what reports have been quoted. And issues come only when the marriage breaks up and they have a case, and then they come to court and they find they're coming either for applying for a marriage certificate so that they can prosecute each other. But that should not be happening, right? That should not be the case. So we need to be able to take away that, I don't know what term to use, but definitely not child-friendly rape provision, and put in place a little more friendly, human, provisions so that children do not necessarily become, dragged into being made into criminals, right? And this is an area where I think there is a lot of activism needed from both the women's side, from youth, and for that matter, from children's organizations, civil society organizations, to change that, provision.
Children, a lot of children have become victims of this law, which is supposed to protect the children. I think time is nearly up, so we'll take any more questions. As a final question, I want to ask you your take on the UN. This year we are celebrating 50 years of UN in Bhutan. Earlier you talked about the works of UN and how the local institutions and CSOs should also collaborate and work together. to utilize the scarce resources effectively. There is a general perception in Bhutan, and probably also in other countries where you work, that UN almost works like an elite bureaucracy, and resources don't even look very scarce. So how would you view 50 years of UN service in Bhutan, and what could be done better?
You know, like I said, as both a child rights and human rights advocate on the ground, I am a strong critic of UN and other international agencies as well, in terms of how the structures, institutions, and functionality could be more friendly, right? And sometimes, I also find it very uncomfortable that many of these UN and NGOs who are supposed to be taking care of children leave behind, stay behind, such security that even children forget children. Even adults, hesitate to go near the gates. And I had one very unpleasant experience in one country where I had a meeting in an agency like that. And when I got out of the car, 2 street children selling flowers straight near the gate, and the security guard came and shooed them away. Now, I found that really, really disturbing, and I actually made a complaint. Now, that's one side. But on the other side, if you don't have a UN, and what is there? We need a check and balance system. And we also need, if this part is not able to do what it is supposed to be doing, we need another source or institution or organization or professionals that deliver or meet that filling that gap, isn't it? So it depends on how you look at it. UN's criticism, like you said, is always been that it is considered a very elite and very complex and of course very attractive organization. But if you are, and I've worked within UN, I've worked with UNIFEM, I've worked with UNICEF, I've worked with the UN Mission, I've also worked with a number of NGOs at the advisory level. And I also know how much UN agencies struggle to raise the necessary resources. What comes to the core funds do not necessarily meet what is required. So they have to then compete for resources, projects, and a lot of struggle goes in. So most outside do not understand the trials and tribulations that go in within an organization. But at the end of the day, you need a UN agency that acts as an independent, unbiased, institution that not only helps, guides, supplements, but also holds some accountability measure with the state institutions and parties, and also sets that benchmark in terms of what needs to be done and what must be done.
Are you already thinking of something that you'll suggest to CRC in terms of changes, new introduction?
Well, CRC itself, treaty bodies ourselves need a lot of rethinking and soul searching.
It's a lot.
We are struggling, so we are not going to. I don't think I should get into that.
Okay.
But the fact is, whatever we do, we need to establish credibility. We need to prove to our target audience that we are doing what we can and we are trying to do the right thing, right? I think that is the biggest challenge with UN and all other treaty bodies, including the CRC. We are struggling with the independent communications and complaints, and we have so much backlog that people who complain actually give up down the line, right? And sometimes become even victims for making that complaint. So the challenges are huge.
So finally, what motivates you to go on doing what you're doing? Do you have any sort of practices, like some people do meditation, others go on long walks, or some people do reading, others listen to radios? Do you have anything that keeps you on top of things?
Well, one thing is that I have very simple philosophy. Do everything that makes you feel good. And one of my young friends from Bangladesh said, your purpose in life, once you established, the only baggage you need to carry with you when you go is a happy heart and a clean mind. You see? So if you have that, you can continue. And I have no, rosy grandeur visions, lofty ideals. I'm just a simple, hard-working, let's say connected child rights foot soldier. Over the years, I've a lot of friends that I've connected with. I've now created a lot of networks, a lot of, ground foot teams, so that, they keep me running, because even if I don't want to, every day I have, 10, 11, 12 calls from different networks discussing on various issues. But more importantly, that nagging urge to do something for my country. Like, I feel that what I am is, like I said before, what my country made me. And I believe that I must not waste that opportunity which I've got. The government sponsored me, my candidature also to the CRC committee, and I got elected with a handsome, number of votes. And now I have that opportunity. I must do what I can to serve the children of Bhutan. And serving the children of Bhutan is actually directly serving my country. So basically that is something which keeps me going. And of course, over a number of even in my life, I've always had a number of motivating, inspiring contact with our fourth king, and as well as with our fifth king, and now with what is happening with the COVID response, how much our king is struggling. I'm used to saying my king because that's how I talk in other countries, but for the safety and security of our people, to keep us safe from the COVID pandemic and the ravages of what this pandemic can do. I only hope that our Bhutanese people become much more responsible and behave a little more responsibly in terms of following the government directives, and put value on the amount of effort His Majesty is putting in, so that we stay safe and not go the way other countries are going through. And I think Bhutan is a role model even in the COVID pandemic response. And that's how I think we should be, and we should be motivated. Every Bhutanese must feel motivated to be able to move forward in this manner.
So final question, we offered 2 books. You have chosen 2 titles. Can you tell us about the 2 titles?
This book, The Present as History and Critical Perspectives on Global Power, this has a number of authors, and it is a compilation of number of lecture series or researches. And my interest is mainly to look at how development per se and how economic pursuit for so-called human development has actually impacted on improving rights of women and children on the ground and vulnerable population. And it presents a very critical overview of the so-called economic development sometimes loses sight of actual development of of humanity on the ground, because post-colonialism, I think the larger energy and effort in creating that economic development, which is mainly for production, for export and import, ignored the more fundamental local consumer needs. And sometimes there are enough evidence to show that it has been a direct cause for that divide between the rich and poor. The rich became richer, the poor became poor. And even in this pandemic, I think the same story is being replayed again. While the needs of the country are basically to ensure that we have adequate supplies to survive, sometimes the policies are driven by the need for enhancing or scaling up productions, which do not necessarily translate into harmony on the ground, right? So this is one. So I use this as a basis for a lot of my argument when I work on violence against children, and particularly looking at the industry and corporate world. One of the books which I've been recommended to read is The Twilight of Democracy. This is this seductive lure of authoritarianism. And the couple who actually asked me to read this, and they've reminded me twice. I've never been able to take that. I have not surprisingly made that effort to get that book, this book. But from what they have given to me is, they think that the world needs a model of governance and democracy like we have in Bhutan. Not the type of democracy that is beginning to exhibit out there, like, for example, take America and the democracy under Trump. Look at Russia. Look at African nations, where democracy has been basically used for further individual powers and authoritarian regimes. And this couple had visited Bhutan, and they were so taken back by that system we have. From the time we became a member of the UN agency, how during our third king and fourth king, the process of decentralization, involving people in development, keeping children at the center of our development, and then ultimately now with the fourth king, abdicating power in favor of our present king, and the constitution provisions for age, the qualifications of parliaments, and then the type of division of roles for parliamentarians and to His Majesty, and that welfare and community harmony and also strengthening community resilience is largely kept under His Majesty, so that it is not diluted or fabricated by power struggles or vested interests. So they felt that it would be an interesting read for me.
Thank you very much for such an enjoyable conversation and a lot of insights and pieces of wisdom that we shared. I end the session normally with a relevant Bhutanese proverb, and talking about child rights, I felt that the primary responsibility of children's rights and well-being should actually rest on the parents. And it's really good parenting that is probably first and foremost so important for child well-being. And here is a Dzongkha Chetamor proverb. Bukiship Tuchiship go. One who knows how to produce a child must know how to cut the umbilical cord. So with that, thank you everyone for watching us. Thank you.
Thank you.